What is going on, everybody? I'm coming at you with a OP02 tier list. This tier list is going to be focused on all of the leaders that we have available up to this date, what's going to be good for the upcoming meta, what's going to be bad, what you should look out for, and what I think could be a dark horse contender for one of the better decks in the format. So without too much, introduction, let's hop on in. First off, we're going to start with Monkey D. Garp. I think that Garp is going to be a tier 2 deck. I think that it strictly has a little bit of color cohesion issues when it comes to red and black. Black wants to reduce cost a lot, whereas black wants to reduce cost a lot, whereas red wants to reduce the power, and so they kind of clash a little bit. While there are some powerful cards in both black and red, I do not foresee this deck being particularly strong. If it does take some events, I believe that's just because of the strength of the individual red and black cards and not due to the strength of the leader itself. Moving forward, we're going to talk about Sakazuki. This card is straight up tier 3. It's one of the worst leaders in the game, I think. It's too slow, and there are way better options for black at this point. I think both Z and Smoker are better leaders. And while I think, Garp is like probably the low end of tier 2, Sakazuki is the bottom of tier 3. Moving on to Ivankov. I think Ivankov is a tier 1.5 deck, and the reason is because there is a ton of blue support out there right now, and this card can really pop off, and a lot of decks can struggle against the amount of card advantage it could generate, as well as the fact that it can always counter off, and then get to the point where it has so many big bodies on the board, and you're unable to answer them. When you can get the Ivankov out there, cycle some cards, as well as drop another big body and force your opponent to answer 2 cards, and you've weathered your up to your 7 Dawn turn. Hitting that 7 Dawn turn for Ivankov is an extremely important moment in the game, and with the amount of tools they have, they can restand with Mr. Galdino, which can not only swing and clear, but also restand to block on the following turn. The card is just incredible. So I think that Ivankov is really going to be a dark horse in this format, and I think 1.5 is a pretty good spot for it. It can take some wins against some of the strong decks, and while it may struggle sometimes against things like Zoro, I think all in all it's a pretty strong deck. Moving on to Sanji here. I think that Sanji is probably in tier 2 here. I haven't play tested enough to see if it can maybe go into 1.5. Sanji can be a really strong deck just because it generates a lot of Dawn advantage, which means that you can always use your counter cards essentially if you're playing your turns right. The only downside is you're playing a ton of vanillas, and while there's a lot of great combos that you can run with the film cards that come out in this set, like the Zoro and the Brook, Zoro and the Usopp, not the Brook, you can drop the 7-drop Luffy on your 7-drop turn to play the 4-drop Zoro, which then actives 2 Dawn for you for a counter card, for example. Being able to run Love Beam and Punk Gibson is super impactful, as well as being able to run the 3 sword style card, which is like a 3-cost counter card, which is extremely strong in my opinion, and being able to play more cards from hand is really good. The only issue is that you do lack a lot of removal in the deck, I find, and you don't really have a way of dealing with some problem threats, so that's why I think it sits in tier 2. Moving forward to Kinemon. Kinemon is going to be a tier 1 deck, strictly because the amount of board control that it can provide is crazy, and the deck basically plays like Kid, except instead of having a double attacker, you have a character who can reduce cost on your mono characters, and the flexibility with this leader is crazy strong. You can reduce the cost of your character first, then play like a Momo to search, and then on your 3rd character, then play another character again and still get that cost reduction. So card is fairly good. Being able to turn to Okiku is also absurd. A lot of decks cannot deal with it. I think the only deck that can realistically deal with the turn to Okiku consistently is probably black with Kobe. But outside of that, there's not a lot that most decks can do. It's extremely hard to deal with a turn to Okiku, and it basically means that any card you play is going to get rested and then swung over. Also, being able to access the 4-drop Yamato for only 3 cost is insanely powerful. Being able to rest anything 6 cost or less means that anything your opponent's putting on board is going to get rested and swung over. So Kinemon's very, very strong. I think it can struggle against decks that are hyper aggressive because it plays a lot like Kid did, where you want to sit back, get your pieces, control the board, and then once your opponent's out of resources, you have a board that they just cannot get over. Moving on to Z, I think Z is probably a tier 2 deck. I don't know how strong black is in this format, and I don't think black is a particularly strong deck right now. The problem with black that I've noticed is that it lacks a lot of draw power, and a lot of the cards that you're playing force you to discard to get the maximum value. And it also feels like a lot of games you have dead cards in your hand that you cannot use, because black is seriously lacking any kind of board wipe potential, which I know that they're going to get in the future. But with the lack of draw power and board wipe, if you consistently have to put yourself down a card just to deal with a threat, you're going equal in card advantage. You're trading a 1-for-1 still. You're not actually going positive in any way. So that can really hurt in certain matchups. They can have strong matchups against green, but the problem against green is that a lot of your bodies that are invulnerable to destruction are often going to get swung over and killed, and then I think it's too slow against Zoro to really have a chance in the upper echelon. Z can do some cost manipulation with purple and black. You can lower the cost and then pop them with your big bodies. The issue with this deck is you have to run a lot of cards that have no counter, and that can be kind of detrimental. You're basically forced to run 4 Queen and 4 Borsalino. You're basically forced to run the 7-drop King and the 6-drop King. You're forced to run things like Suru so that you can get the minus cost. Though that is a 2k counter, again, you don't want to be dumping out your 2k counter all the time just to deal with cards. Again, you can play things like Sakazuki as well as Kobe in the deck, but again, lacking the draw power. And then you also have no real consistent way of replenishing your Dawn on Dawn minus effects. You could run things like Ein, but that's just another card that has no counter. So that's why I think Z is going to sit there. I have seen a couple of interesting film variations of the Z deck that look pretty interesting, but I don't think it's going to be much better than tier 2. Moving on, I think Shanks, again, for the same reasons that Z is in tier 2, there's just not enough support for film right now. And as someone who's played the film deck quite a bit, it's basically purple light. There's no... You're not ramping fast enough. I mean, you can play the Eins and the promo Udas at this point, as well as the secret rare Udas to ramp up. But the problem is you don't really have any finishers. You don't have a big character that comes out like board wipe Kaido once you've ramped up. Yes, you can get a lot of characters out there really fast and put a lot of pressure on your opponent. I think against Kaido, this deck is not super great, but I think against other decks, it could be problematic. I just don't know how it fits in the meta right now with its speed. I think if you run a variation that's extremely aggro with the promo Uda as well as the secret rare Uda, and Ein, and you're just pumping out Dawn, you can get to 10 Dawn extremely fast, and your opponent might not be able to answer the plays that you can make when you're dropping Douglas Bullet. And having access to a lot of 2k counters as well as cards that trigger out of life can be strong. I just don't know how strong it's going to be, or if it has enough endgame power once you get to that 10 Dawn. So I think some more testing is warranted on the film deck, but as of right now, in tier 2. Moving on to Magellan, this card's a meme. I think the character card is fine, is like a 1 or 2 of in most purple decks, because it's great in the mirror matchup, and it can really hamper some opponents' games. The leader itself, though, it's just, it's so slow, and to get the effect, you have to use your non-minus effects, and you're not usually using those early game. And you don't really have any reliable ways to bring back Dawn in this deck because he's not an Animal Kingdom pirate, so it just feels kind of honestly. So the card is basically like a meme at this point. Why would you run him over Shanks, Z, or Kaido? And you wouldn't, so that's why, you know, he's going to be in the meme tier. Moving on to Smoker. I think Smoker is going to be at the upper end of tier 2, and that is strictly because of the fact that Smoker is going to be played a lot because Black's a new color. I think Smoker is the best leader for Black. He synergizes the best with what they want to do right now. I think that there are some favorable matchups for Black. Like, I think Blue is actually a pretty favorable matchup for Black because they can get rid of a lot of their problem cards. Think about things like Ivankov. They drop the Ivankov, and then you can immediately answer with your leader effect plus a Sakazuki to kill that. Secret Rare Kuzan really cripples some boards, and I think if played properly, Black can be strong. I just think that it really struggles against red, and it really struggles against green sometimes. So struggling against the two best decks in the format are probably why it's going to sit back in tier 2. I think it has strong matchups against purple and blue, but again, red and green are going to be so problematic for it, so I think it sits there nicely at the top end of tier 2. Moving on to Whitebeard. I think Whitebeard is likely going to be the second best deck in the format. It's going to be the second most popular deck in the format from what I've seen. Whitebeard is a very interesting and unique concept, and it's very new to OP02. Having a leader with 6,000 power that essentially draws you a card extra every turn is, very alluring for a lot of players, and it has a lot of strong cards to back it up. Things like Vista, which are absolutely broken. You can run the Mountain Bandit plus Makino combo if you want to. You can run a more defensive combo with Marcos, and you can run more blockers. There's lots of different ways you can play Whitebeard. I think the best way to play Whitebeard is to sit back and defend with a bajillion counter cards in your hand, and then once Moby Dick is active, you start swinging away, and your opponent can't counter out these 8k swings consistently. And then once you can survive to 9 Dawn, if you can drop an Edward Newgate, a lot of decks will have a tough time dealing with an 8k leader every turn. So if you're having an 8k leader and you're dropping a Newgate and they can't swing over, then you're in a really rough situation. And then they're often going to be able to counter off from 8k. So I think Whitebeard is going to be a really strong deck. It's going to get hard for some people to learn how to play against it. And I think it's going to take a lot of people some time to figure out the best way to beat the deck. And I think you have to rush it down. And that leads us to our next criteria, or next top deck, and that's going to be Zoro. So Zoro is going to be the best deck in the format because 1, it's a very easy deck to play, 2, it's very accessible, and 3, it does really well against Whitebeard, which is going to be one of the more popular decks in the format. Zoro, I think, I've played a ton of the Zoro deck currently. All of the 1-drops make it really easy to play. It's a lot of aggression really fast, and a lot of decks have a tough time dealing with that. And because there's so many searchers in the deck, it often does not run out of steam, and you have some really great finishers with the 5-drop Luffy as well as the 3-drop Zoro. So this deck is just, it's all out aggression. You just swing face, and you can run a lot of the best red cards, and there is a more mid-range way of playing the deck still, with like Edward Newgates. However, this card is just absolutely crazy with the addition of Curly Dedan, Dogura, and Makino to buff up your things like Sunny, to buff up your Nami, and to even make cards like Otama an active threat on board is kind of insane. So keep an eye out for Zoro. It's going to be the best deck in the format. I think we'll see it take the most tops. Moving on to Blue Purple Crocodile. Now, this is a deck that I have a lot of, personal feelings towards. I think this deck can be really strong, and I think with the additions to the deck in OP02, it has a chance to be a really strong deck with some pretty favorable matchups. I think the biggest issue for Blue Purple Crocodile is the fact that it's 4 life. It's pretty incredible, the card support that it gets, especially with the errata, where now the former Baroque Works cards are also included in those Baroque Works effects, is pretty absurd. Being able to run Mr. Galdino and Inazuma are really strong blockers for the deck, especially when you're always going to be dishing out your hand to counter stuff and then replenishing it with counter cards. There's addition of some new counter cards as well as some new top end in Ivankov, and being able to play out the 5-drop Crocodile, so you have a lot more aggressive turns later on once you've weathered some swings, which I think makes the deck better, as well as you have access to a lot of removal with things like Rush Kaido, with things like King. So keep an eye out for Blue Purple Crocodile. I think it could surprise some people. Moving on to Red-Green Luffy, and this is another deck that's I think's already surprised some people. I'm putting it in tier 1.5 simply because of how much it surprised me in OP01, and a lot of cards that it gets are just more support for the deck. I think this deck, if played well, has the potential to really pop off, and we saw it win a Treasure Cup, which I don't think anybody saw that happening prior to it happening. So Red-Green Luffy, again, it plays very similarly to Law, but it has the ability to restand characters, and so you're going to be using the restand law in combination with this to get multiple swings off in turn 8 late game with something like your unblockable Luffy is just an absolute massive power play. So again, this card is phenomenal, and again, it surprised a lot of people, and there's a lot of green and red cards coming out that's going to lend further support to both this deck and to the next deck that I'll cover, which is Law. And again, I think Law is going to be strong again. It's always going to have the potential to make a lot of plays, and with the addition of things like Makino and Vista, it makes it a lot stronger, as well as getting access to Usopp and Zoro from the film cards. Just some nice vanillas that you can play off your leader effect that have nice board presence. And then again, you're still going to have things like your Trafalgar Law effect and your Trafalgar Law blocker, who can, bounce characters back. So this is going to be very much similar to how it was. I don't think it deserves to be in tier 1. I think it deserves to be probably at the bottom of tier 1.5, just because, again, I think it struggles against decks like Whitebeard because it doesn't have enough offensive power to get high enough. And I think it struggles against things like Wano and Zoro because they can either 1, out-aggress them, or 2, control the board better. So I think it's kind of like a worse version of all of like the 3 top decks in one deck. Jack of all trades, master of none. Moving on to Red Luffy. Red Luffy is probably going to be near the bottom end of tier 2, just because I don't think anyone's going to be playing it, and there doesn't really seem to be much reason to play this deck over something like Zoro at this point in time. I think the deck will still be strong. It'll be very similar to what it was in OP01. I don't think a ton of the support really benefits Luffy at this point. And again, like there's no reason to run the Luffy over the Zoro. It does a lot of the same things, but it's more control oriented. And I think the control oriented playstyle suffers against things like Kinemon and Whitebeard. So that's why I think it takes a step back. And it's borderline 1.5 and 2. I think it's like low end 1.5, high end 2. So again, it's playable, but why would you play it over Zoro? Moving on, Kazuki Odin, you belong in the meme tier. I think there's no reason to play this card. It is just a worse version of Kinemon, and it doesn't do anything. And while there's Wano support, it's not going to be good. I won't see anybody playing it. Moving forward, we're going to talk about Crocodile, and I think he's going to be tier 3. Again, I think the best blue decks in this format are going to be Sanji, Ivankov, and blue-purple Crocodile. I think the plain blue Crocodile, while there is lots of support for blue Croc, just for the fact that there's tons of blue support coming out, I think that they're better used in the other blue decks, and, I think those decks just do what this deck wants to do, but better. Blue-purple Kaido. Blue-purple Kaido did surprise me a little bit at the Treasure Cup. It took some high placings. I think that it can be a good card, but I think right now with the 4 life, there's not enough advantage to running this card over the Ivankov or over the Sanji right now. While I think it can be strong, I think it's just going to be doing what purple does, but worse. And I think that it's while it's strong, I would just rather play normal Kaido in the situation, because I think the blue cards that we got in the set for support don't really support the blue-purple Kaido playstyle, and there wasn't really a ton of purple support that benefits this playstyle as well, so I think it's going to sit there. Kaido, I think, is going to be tier 1 again. This deck is you live and die by Onigashima Island. I think board-wide Kaido is extremely strong, especially against a lot of these decks that want to play big bodies and they want to have them sit out there. It can wipe a lot of boards, and it's still pretty relevant. It does really well against Whitebeard. It can really out-aggress some decks, and I think, again, it's a super strong deck.
King is meme tier. I don't want to talk about this card. This card's terrible. I wish I didn't even include it on my tier list. It's terrible. Doflamingo, again, it's probably tier 2. All the support that blue got really doesn't benefit its playstyle, and the whole like swarm the field with cards just feels like it's better in Ivankov than it is in Doflamingo. It's so like archetype specific, and a lot of the support for blue has nothing to do with Doflamingo's archetype. So I think that, you know, it's going to sit in tier 2. And last but not least is Kid, and I think Kid's still going to be tier 1. Kid, nothing's really changed that makes Kid worse. The only difference between last format and this format is that there's another color, and some decks have some more threats on Kid with bigger bodies. I think black can be a pretty strong threat towards Kid. However, I mean, the way that the deck plays, you could still edge out wins against any color, and the way the deck wants to play against green, I think it's gonna be a worse version of Kinemon, just because Kinemon can get you so much tempo early, but I mean, Kid double swinging can get you a lot of tempo early as well. So there's lots of potential for Kid to, you know, to fall or to even rise in this format with some of the new support that they get. So keep an eye out on Kid. I think you can run basically the exact same deck with a Kid leader or Kinemon leader, and it really doesn't matter. They're both going to succeed just because the cards in the deck are so strong. Well, that wraps up my tier list. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Let me know what you think about the tier list, and keep an eye out for, you know, any kind of content that you're looking forward for OP02. I'm gonna have a lot of videos coming out shortly. I hope to get out a bunch before I am going away for surgery, and I'll be probably out for 4 to 6 weeks, so I probably won't have a ton of content coming out, but I'll try and schedule some stuff so that it's a bit staggered, so that there's still some things coming out with some OP02 gameplay, because I'm really excited for the set, and I'm kind of bummed to be, you know, sick for so long. But thankfully after the online regionals, I should be rested up for the in-person ones in Montreal. So again, thanks to everyone for tuning in. I appreciate all the support, and until next time, Monty out.